and welcome to another History Bites episode with yours truly, Penny Griffiths Morgan. Now, if you don't know who I am, that's alright, I'm going to tell you, but I do as you can see down there, I do the Haunted Histories stuff. So I do a fortnightly podcast on Paranormal UK Radio. I also I have a website that has regular blogs on a sort of weekly 10-day basis on different things to do with history that I think people would find interesting. Obviously, I've got the Haunted Histories YouTube channel, which hopefully you found by watching this little video that I've put together for you, presentation. I'm also an author. I've written 2 books called My Haunted History and A Haunted Experiment, and I also write a regular feature for Haunted magazine called Not So Horrible Histories. Among other things, there are other things I do, but I will not bore you with my CV right now. Now, the reason for this presentation is a couple of months ago I put on my Facebook page a bit of a sort of poll as to what people would like me to talk about next after my castle mission and my Guide to the Victorian Workhouse talk, and this was the one that proved most popular. Anyone who knows me knows that I am absolutely fascinated by the whole sort of poor law, how it was treated in the Victorian era, some of the changes they were trying to bring out to help the poor. And sometimes my views on it do get vilified because I don't come out and say it was really bad, it was really this, it was really that. Yes, compared to what we have now, it was bad, but compared to what they had previously, it wasn't. And that's the thing I think people need to remember, just that little bit more, that although we see it now as being bad and awful and it should never happen, it was an improvement on what they had. But why is education important, and why did the Victorians start, actually pre the Victorians, the Georgians, pre-Queen Victoria's reign, actually realised this was very important and they needed to look into it? And it was basically to get children out of that poor cycle, that constant repetition of the grandparents were poor and relied on the workhouse, the parents were poor and relied on the workhouse, the children would be poor and relied. They needed to get them out of that. One of the things they realised, it was the illiteracy of so many poor children because they couldn't afford an education. Now, some of them, it was that they couldn't afford that education because they had to go out to work from a tiny age. We see the photos of kids in slums in sort of London and Manchester and places like that, tiny little children of like 4 or 5 going out selling bits of wood and things to try and make a bit of extra money for mum or dad. That's what they had to do. You know, children it wasn't as child-centric a society as it is now. But why did I call this slide Christmas Past? Well, you'll see very, very shortly, but as with all things Victorian, and typically all things to do with the poor sort of changes and the Victorians, Dickens has a role, as with so many things. Now, what did they have? What were the options before some of these changes came about? Well, for the rich, the affluent, those with a bob or two in their pocket, they'd have a governess. And quite simply, if you've read things like Jane Eyre and all those kind of things, you'll have quite a good idea of what governess actually was and what their role was. Basically, they were there to get the boys ready to go to public schools at about 12, places like Rugby and those kind of places. And they were there to get the girls ready for domesticity and marriage. So they'd be teaching the girls etiquette. They might teach them how to read and write, but not to the level they were expected to teach the boys to. They would teach them sewing and those kind of skills, should we say. The governess would normally come from a middle class family because she would be expected to be able to read and write to a reasonably good level, so she would have had to be educated herself. But they weren't looked on very favourably, if you like, because these were single women. Now, whether they were single because they'd never married or whether they were single because they were widowed, and there was an awful lot of negativity surrounding women who weren't married. It's like, why are they not good enough? Why couldn't they find a man? Everyone's woman's place was to be married and having children. But these governesses, they would earn around £25 a year, which would be way out of the range of the average poorer family, even if they all club together to pay for one. So what did they have? Well, they had two real options before the sort of early 1800s. They had what were known as dame schools. Now, a dame school was nothing more really than a childminding service in a lot of cases. It would be a woman, normally a slightly older woman, who would have loads of children come to her for a couple of pence a week, if not less, and ostensibly it would be to teach them to read and write, but in a lot of cases it was kind of like a nursery. What I find interesting about that is it wasn't until the later 1800s that laws came in as to children weren't allowed to work until they were a certain age. So a lot of these would be children whose parents probably didn't want them to work and wanted them looked after whilst they went to work. Dame schools served a purpose. They weren't horrific places, but they weren't what I would call schools the way we know them. Then we had Sunday schools. Now, Sunday schools were very popular, basically because those children who worked, the one day they didn't work was a Sunday. And Sunday schools were pioneered by a chap by the name of Robert Raikes. Now, he's not a nice guy, if you ask me, verging on abusive. He was very much of the belief that you spare the rod, you spoil the child. And some of the things he used to do to you know, he would beat children. He endorsed in his guides sort of taking a child's hand and holding it to a red hot pipe if they were naughty, that kind of thing, because under the whole sort of religious, I suppose, kind of doctrine, they believed that children were born naturally evil. So educating them wasn't to educate them to be intellectuals, it was to educate them to be moral, have morals. Which is why with the Sunday schools, the only textbook they had was the Bible. There was very little learning, as opposed to learning how to read the Bible. They didn't do numeracy, their writing was very, very basic. But I suppose it still taught children to read, albeit the only thing they could read is the Bible, and then they were sort of expected to look at things like catechism and all that kind of thing. But they were popular, and one of the reasons was Sunday were the only day a child would not be expected to work, so they could receive their education and they could also receive their religious guidance, for want of a better term. Those sort of things, they lasted for a long time. They were around for a while, but then it started to change. What was Christmas present? What did it change to? Well, you still had governesses. You still do now, really. You still had the governesses. They were teaching the affluent kids. But the poor kids started to get more choice. They still had the Sunday schools. They still had the dame schools. Then you had, from the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 with the workhouses, and how many of you remember this? I should test you really, shouldn't I? See if you watched my other presentation. That they introduced any child in the workhouse had to have 3 hours of education between the ages of 5 and 12 every day. This was unheard of. This wasn't something that poor children were entitled to. But they knew that by going into the workhouse, they were expected to learn. They would have those 3 hours of education every day from the age of 5 until they were 12. And that education would follow lots of things. It would, the 3 R's, for want of a better term, reading, writing, arithmetic. They would be learning numbers. They would be learning to read and write. And this is one of the things about the workhouse that I think was actually good, that they were trying to stop the children having to rely on the workhouse again by giving them this, well, it was a free education at the end of the day. And then you had the 3 main types of schools that started to pop up. Sorry, I think she knows. Started to pop up. The British foreign schools, the ragged schools, and the national schools. Now, whilst there was a similarity in all of them, in that they taught children of little or no means, there was actually quite a different ethos in each school. In the British foreign schools, they were non-denominational. They would accept all religions, and in fact, you can go through some of the admission logs of for example, the school at Hitchin, which I'm going to talk about, and they would actually put in there what religion someone belonged to. And going through them, it was fascinating. It was religions I didn't even know people followed in the 1800s. So they weren't religion specific. They weren't following a purely Roman Catholic perspective or a a purely Lutheran perspective or purely Protestant perspective. They would follow lots of different, it was all about learning, it wasn't religious. The ragged schools, they were slightly different as well. Now they were formed by a chap in Portsmouth, actually, they believe formed one of the first ones in the late 1700s. His name was John Pounds, and he was actually a cobbler who wanted to help educate the poor children of Portsmouth, and he formed one of the early ragged schools, in his front room. Lord Shaftesbury was actually oversaw the ragged school, I suppose, movement, for want of a better term, for about 39 years. He believed in it so strongly. And Charles Dickens, and this is where the Dickens reference comes in, he actually visited a ragged school in London called Field Lane, and it's believed that it was visiting here that gave him the inspiration to write A Christmas Carol, hence Christmas Past. Can you get where I'm going with this now? There's method in my madness. Now, like I say, we've mentioned the workhouse schools, we've mentioned the British, we've gone through all of those. The national schools, where did they fit in? Well, there were similarities in teaching methods to the British foreign schools, because the chap who devised the national schools was a chap by the name of Andrew Bell, and his methods were very similar to the chap who devised British foreign schools, the Lancasterian method, Joseph Lancaster, with the whole monitorial side. But the main thing about the national schools is the cynic might say they were set up to rival BFS, the British foreign schools, because they thought it was awful that the British foreign schools were coming away from the religious sort of side of things and the Church of England, and they were breaking from the church and trying to be non-denominational. So the national schools were very, very Church of England focused. There was a very, very strong focus on religious guidance and religious education in them. But were these schools free? Yes and no. They were very low cost. It might cost a couple of pence to go to one of these schools. The ragged schools did tend to be free. But what they did do is, where they were set up, especially the national schools and the British foreign schools, where they were set up, they would have staggered rates of learning. So it might be that if you're the child of a farmer, you had to pay 4p a week to go. But if you were the child of a labourer, for example, a farmer's labourer or a building labourer or whatever, someone who was in a class as a non-skilled occupation, you might only have to pay 2p a week to go. Now, to give you an idea of what things cost back in the day, well, in London I found some figures, and in the mid-1800s, a single room would cost around 3 shillings 6p a week. And the average family who were living reasonably moderately would probably have a bill of around £2 a week. Now that doesn't seem a lot. It doesn't seem a lot. But then when you look at if it was a single woman who maybe had lost her husband, someone who was unskilled, illiterate, all those kind of things, she might be lucky to earn, say, 2 shillings 6p a week for doing 11-hour days. Or 11 hours per day, 2 shillings 6p for doing 11 hours as a washwoman. Or someone who was matchbox making, which is quite a famous one, which we hear a lot about, especially in East London, with Bow and with the Fosjaw and all that kind of thing. They might earn 1.5 shillings a day. They can't afford, if they're trying to feed a family and pay for a room, they can't really afford a shilling a week for a child to go to school. So a lot of these schools would also be put in certain places where they would fit the demographics of the area that they were in. Now, where did they go from there? Now, I'm not saying these were the only schools. There were other schools. The Roman Catholics had their own schools. They tended to be free or even cheaper, because Roman Catholics, the Roman Catholic communities tended to be quite poor. You may then have Lutheran or Wesleyan specific schools that tended to cost a little bit more, because their communities tended to have a bit more money, and it was all commensurate with what people had available to try and help their children and help people to learn. Sorry, just find the key there. Now, so we've looked at these 3 types of schools, and I would I would say you can read about the Ragged School in my book, My Haunted Histories, the one in London, the one that's actually open as a museum. Mentioned John Pounds. There was also a chap by the name of Guthrie from Edinburgh, who is also meant to have set something up very, very similar at the time that John Pounds did. But they're pretty much everywhere. If you look around, you can find them, which I'm going to get onto in a second. The British foreign schools, I mentioned the chap Joseph Lancaster. Now, he was a fascinating character. Not the best businessman, as I'm finding as I'm writing about Hitching and John Lancaster at the moment. Joseph Lancaster, sorry. But he was a great teacher, and he really, really believed in the skill of teaching and how to convey this stuff to children in the best possible way. Now, he's believed to have formed his first school in London in 1798, and he started to form more schools, and the Royal Lancastrian Society was formed. But whether it's to do with his lack of finance skills, whether it's to do with the fact he's a little bit erratic, he was prone to mental health, bad bouts of mental health, it actually became the British and foreign schools in the early 1800s, and he was kind of pushed out a little bit. But good old Joseph went over to America and South America and started forming Lancasterian schools over there, based on his method of the monitorial method. You've also got the national schools that I mentioned. Now, these are interesting ones. Like I said, they believed that children were naturally evil, so education had to be moral, not intellectual. And these were, as I say, I think formed to rival the non-religious bias that was in the British foreign schools. But they covered pretty much anything. They covered pretty much every demographic that you could think of. But what made them all slightly different? Well, here you've got some pictures of some ragged schools. Now, what's fascinating is that the one on the nearest to my face, so I can't even think how to point it, there, that one there, that's not in the UK, that's actually in Australia. That's how far this kind of method of education went, all the way to Australia. That one was actually, I suppose, formed. The one next to it with the red door right over there, I can't get my finger far enough, right over there with the red door, that's actually in Manchester. That's actually Charter Street Ragged School in Manchester. And then the one at the bottom was actually a photo taken of a load of children outside the Ragged School in East London, which actually still looks like that out the front. It's fascinating. But ragged schools weren't just there to teach. Like I say, these schools all had similarities, but then they all had slight differences, I suppose you could say. The ragged schools, a lot of children who went to ragged schools were, I suppose the phrase would be dirt poor. They had nothing. And when you read about these children having 5 or 6 siblings, and they had to share a coat, or they had to share their shoes, a lot of these ragged schools would also have donations of clothes and footwear and things like that for these children, so that they had their own shoes or they had their own coat, so that they didn't have to share with their siblings. They also were sometimes the only place a child would get a good meal each day, and the hours at the ragged school were quite long. The hours at these schools were pretty much 9 to 5, and they believe that's where the whole 9 to 5 thing came from, the working 9 to 5, not from Dolly Parton. They actually believe it came from the schools because it was supposed to start getting them into the idea of a working day, even though the working day back in the Victorian time was a lot more than 9 to 5. So you can see these schools, these ragged schools, not only were they teaching children to read and write, and then maths and to add and basic skills like that, they were also caring for them. And hence they were known, the reason they were called ragged schools is children were pretty much turning up in their rags. Now, these schools died out around 1870, which is pretty much to do with the acts that started coming out around then, but I'm going to get onto those in a second. Now, the next type of school we can have a quick look at are the national schools. Remember I said the national schools were the ones that were very based on Church of England teachings and the Bible and very religious. you can find them everywhere. You really can find them everywhere. In fact, the bottom photo, the school that's kind of more of a red brick colour, that's actually a village hall. And it's the village hall in the village where my in-laws live. And when I drove past it first time, I thought, oh, that looked like an old school. And so I slowed down and took photos, and you actually see it does say there, National School. And it was the National School for the area. And if you look closely, there is a church nearby as well. That's always a giveaway for the national schools. If you're not sure if a school was a national school, firstly look at the size of the building. They were quite small. They were kind of village-esque schools, and you'll see that a bit more with some of the other ones I'm going to talk about. They weren't on the big scale that British schools were, or on the huge scale that the ragged schools were. Ragged schools tended to be in the cities where there were slum areas, as did some of the British schools, but they were to slightly less large, huge cities. And then you have the national schools. This is pre about 1890 in the smaller villages, and nearly always linked to a church. Now, so we have those type of schools, and you really can genuinely find them anywhere and everywhere. You just need to look. Your history is really on your doorstep if you want to see it. And then we have the British foreign schools. Now, the photo at the top, the largest one, that's actually of Hitchin British Foreign School, which you can actually go and visit if you so wish, I suppose you could say. It's a fascinating place, though. I can't stress that enough. It's such a good place. Now, the small photo that's sort of overlapping the two other photos, that's actually of the British Foreign School in Shrewsbury. It was up for sale not so long ago, and that was an aerial shot of it. Now, the reason I put the aerial shot in rather than the front shot is when you look at the Hitchin School, it looks quite small. It doesn't look like there's much to it, but it goes out a long way. And it's a very, very similar design to the Shrewsbury one. So it gives you an idea of what the size would have been. The one at the bottom is actually a British school, sorry, I'm getting my words muddled up now, a British school in Birmingham. So you can see where, and that's just 3 of them. I found loads more when I started Googling. There's loads of these buildings around, but the only one that actually is a proper museum with the only Lancasterian classroom left is the one in Hitchin. Now, what did Lancaster do that was so pioneering? One of the things he realised is there was a very, very large number of children who needed to learn how to read and write, and there was a very, very small amount of teachers able to teach them. And those teachers cost money. And if you were going to have classes of 30, 40 children that we would see now, the kids couldn't afford it, which is why they weren't getting educated. So he would set up these huge classrooms with hundreds of children in rows. And they would have stages that they were expected to meet. And those stages or standards, there were 6 to 7 of them, are really the precursor to today's national curriculum. And at the end of each row there would be a monitor who was there slightly above the row, if you like, in learning ability, and would be there to coach them. Now, what was even more interesting, a lot of these monitors would stop being a monitor at 14. Now, if they then chose to go on to teacher training, they could become a teaching apprentice if they so chose to do so. And so it was quite a good way of finding people to then progress them up into teaching, so that they could then start teaching children themselves and have that. They knew where they came from. They came from the same environment, if you like, as those children. Now, what happened then? Well, Christmas Future. Chris Worth, we're following the whole Christmas caroling. It's got to be Christmas Future next, hasn't it? What started to happen? Well, acts started to come in. Now, they've been trying to change the whole system of education for years. Absolutely years. But it took them quite a while. And in that time, whilst they were trying to change it, whilst they were trying to bring things in, more and more schools were being founded. So you would have this little school here. Now, I wouldn't expect you to be able to read what's on the bottom of that slide, but trust me, it says Ketteringham. Now, Ketteringham is a tiny little village in Norfolk. It's actually where I grew up, believe it or not. And I know where the old school is. It doesn't look like that anymore. It's actually a house. It has been for as long as I can remember. And Ketteringham actually opened in 1839 with 50 children. And when you look at the size of the village now and the amount of children that are there now, trust me, you'd be shocked. It didn't shut as a school, which I find astounding, and my parents found astounding as well when I told them, until 1970, when it had gone down to 4 children. 4 children. But that was how important the village school was. And this was a national school, and yes, there is a church about half a mile away. It all links into all the sort of things I've mentioned. And it's in a little village. So it's not going to be a big school, because there's not going to be enough children to populate it. 1 schoolroom, mixed class, national school, which did kind of follow a bit of the monitorial side of things that Lancaster had advocated. It was a bit of an argument between him and Bell, who came up with it first. You've also got, when you start looking at local areas, you can look at your own and see what there was. So I started looking into where I live at the moment in Essex, and I found out that the town I live in, or it's a city officially, had 2 schools. It had both a national school and a Lancasterian one, which is fascinating because you didn't normally find them both in the same place. And what's even funnier is when I looked into the history behind the national school, sadly it's not there anymore because it was linked to what is now our cathedral. But part of what they used was a wine cellar now, which I think is hilarious when you think of the whole religious sort of element of it, that part of the school's now a wine cellar. It just tickles me. But yeah, you can look up your local area and you will find things that actually apply. Now, so what started to happen subsequently? Well, more schools started to get built. In the picture down there is actually of a typical Victorian school that would have been built post about 1890, and it's actually where Hazel Ford of Haunted Happenings can run her investigations. You can actually investigate it when things are all open again, which is wonderful. So what sort of acts came in? Why did things change the way they did? Why did we start seeing education become so important? Well, in 1870 there was something called the Forster Elementary Act, and they pointed out with this that there was something like 4.3 million kids of primary education age, and nearly half of them had 0 education and 0 ability to get an education. Pretty horrific when you think about it. In 1880 they also introduced the fact that children had to go to school from the ages of 5 till 10, although this wasn't enforced perhaps as much as it could have been, because compulsory education had been brought in with the Forster Act, but they started saying no, children have to go to school between the ages of 5 and 10. Although these were all tying in with a lot of the acts to do with industry, the cotton mill acts to stop children working from a certain age, only being allowed to work a certain amount of hours a day, and this all tied in. Then you had another act coming up, the 1891, which meant education became free and all local authorities had to donate a certain amount. I think it was between 5 to 10 shillings, something in that region, towards children gaining an actual education. So they really were trying to improve a child's lot, if you like. Some people say 1891 education became free. It did and it didn't. There was more money for all children to receive an education than there had been previously. And this is why you see schools like Hazel's that were built in the 1890s. Now, here's the proof in the pudding. Did it work? I would say yes, based on this one fact. And if you forget anything, or you remember anything from this presentation, remember this one important fact. In 1837, when Queen Victoria took over the throne, out of 18 million people classed as being in poverty, only 2/3 of the men and half of the women could sign their own name on the marriage register. 50% of women were capable of signing their own name, otherwise they had to put an X, put like a mark. By 1901, when Queen Victoria died, 90% sign their own name. Like I say, if you forget everything else I've talked about, just think of that. That is how much it helped. Now, the impact on poverty, you can also draw parallels with that if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty, because when you start looking at workhouse registers from sort of 1901 onwards, you'll see the dynamics of the people going in there has changed. It's a lot more the elderly, it's a lot more the infirm, it's less and less young people, less and less children going in. And it is quite evident when you start looking at it, the whole dynamics of who was going into it, who was relying on the welfare state was changing. And whether this was due to other things or whether everything was sort of all lumped together to make this perfect storm, who knows? But they definitely did change. But if you remember one thing, remember the Queen Victoria fact I've just told you. Now, like I said, I could talk about this. I could do a couple of hours on each different type of school. There is that much information out there if you want to look at it. But I wanted to give you a brief sort of overview in the 30 minutes that I had. But here's some websites for you to have a look at. You've got the British Schools Museum in Hitching. Unfortunately, I'm doing this presentation on, I'm just looking at the date on the computer, the 1st of July 2020, and we're still in the lockdown, so unfortunately it's still shut, but it will reopen. I'm sure it will reopen. Same with the Ragged School Museum in London. Both places to go to visit if you're interested, or even if you just want to have a nosy, you want to have a day out. You've also got Haunted Happenings. I'm sorry if anyone saw my child walk past just there. You've also got Haunted Happenings who do investigations at their school, the one I mentioned, the Victorian school, the one that was built in the 1890s. And then you've also got, wonderfully enough, Dusk Till Dawn Events. They have an old school. Now theirs, I believe, is Edwardian, but you've still got that sort of, it was the crossover from the Victorian to the next era, if you like, of education. Now, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that's taught you something. If you do have any questions or whatever, please do put a comment below and I'll do my best to answer them. Or head over to my Facebook page or the website. There's an email address on there that you can contact me. And thank you for listening. And I hope to see you soon with my next History Bites presentation.